Thank you very much to Alzheimer Europe for the invitation to be with you today, and I've had the privilege over the last, I guess it's about 18 months now, of working with Alzheimer Europe and 5 constituent organisations on a survey of carers of people with dementia, focusing on the diagnosis and the context around that. So the survey was actually carried out earlier this year. It was funded by a grant from Roche to Alzheimer Europe. 5 national Alzheimer organisations took part: Scotland, Italy, Czech Republic, the Netherlands and Finland. And I just want to emphasise that the development of the survey was a collaborative process. The topics and the questions were agreed between Alzheimer Europe, the organisations, and our research team. And it's been a joy to work with them. Okay. The survey was aimed at people who are currently in a position of supporting a family member or friend who's received a diagnosis, and of course the carer and the person with dementia had to be resident in one of the 5 participating countries. We made the survey available both on an online platform and in paper versions in most countries. And of course it was available in English, Scottish, Italian, in the Finn language and in Czech. Our aim was to achieve a sample of 200 family carers in each of the 5 countries, and I'm pleased to say that we exceeded that number in every country, and rather than having a total sample of 1,000, we've actually got a total sample of just over 1,400. You'll see that there's slight differences between countries in the balance between those who completed the survey online and those who completed a paper version. In the Netherlands, computer literacy is so great that there is no need for paper versions. In other countries, people appreciated that option. The survey was probably about as long as it could be, and possibly slightly longer. Many thanks to any carers in the audience who actually participated. There's a huge amount of data that's come out of this, and so in the context of a relatively brief presentation this morning, I'm just going to concentrate on a couple of aspects. First of all, I'm going to describe to you the sample who took part, so that you understand the context and perhaps some of the differences between countries. Then I'm going to talk about carers' perceptions of whether or not the diagnosis was timely. We often talk about timely diagnosis, and it's part of many strategies. Is that what carers experienced? Did they experience the diagnosis as timely? And then we're going to have a quick look at some of the issues around sharing the diagnosis with the person with dementia, and how that was done, if it was done, and some of the quality indicators around that. And then having a look at, just very briefly, at the sort of sharing process and how carers experience that. There's a lot of data here. These slides will, I think, be made available on the website. There won't be time to go through every data point. I'm not going to try and make too much of differences between countries, except in where that becomes really important. I want to try and draw out as much as possible the general issues about this snapshot of the carers' experience across these European countries. So the first thing to say is, in describing the sample, it seemed to me the most important thing to tell you was that the word most of the people taking part were either the spouse, the husband or wife of the person with dementia, or the son or daughter. There were some slight differences between countries. In Scotland, it was pretty evenly matched between those two types. In Italy and the Czech Republic, the respondents were much more likely to be the adult child of the person with dementia. And in Netherlands and Finland, again, it was a bit more matched. In the Netherlands, perhaps there were more spouses who responded. And so that's important in understanding some of the other differences in the sample. Because clearly, if there are more adult child carers, then the average age of the carer is going to be slightly lower. So overall, the median age of the carers was around 57. You'll see there's quite a distribution there. It was slightly younger in Italy, slightly older in the Netherlands and Finland. In the special symposium sponsored by Roche at lunchtime, we're going to be looking at the data from this survey in relation to gender differences, but the key thing is that most of the sample were female. 83% of the sample were female. This perhaps is slightly more than would be representative, but it's pretty much the situation. We had a very highly educated sample, it seemed. Over half reported a college education or equivalent, with again, the Dutch sample having the highest levels and Italy the lowest. 43% were in employment, a number of those were in part-time employment, just over a third were retired, slightly lower of course where adult children were providing the care in Italy and the Czech Republic. 7 or 8% were not in employment because of the caregiver role. That was highest in Scotland and lowest in Finland. We asked the people responding whether they consider themselves to be the main carer for the person with dementia, or whether there was somebody else who was actually providing most of the care, or whether they were providing it on an equal basis. And what we found was that, again, in Italy and the Czech Republic, people reported being the main carer slightly less, but in those cases, the care tended to be shared on an equal basis. But you'll see that across all the countries, the people responding were by and large the main carer. We asked people about the living arrangements now. As we'll see, this is maybe some years after the actual diagnosis was made, and what we're seeing here is that most people are the person with dementia is living at home with the family carer. A slightly greater proportion in the Netherlands and the Czech Republic who are now in care homes. In Finland, slightly more live alone, and more live with other family in Italy. So there's some differences in living arrangements. The age of the person with dementia, you won't be surprised to know that that their age was rather older than that of the carers. The median age was 77. You can see the distribution. There were perhaps 7 or 8% in total who were under 65, but generally this was an older group of people with dementia. There were slightly more males in the represented in the situation of the person with dementia, but still females predominated, with 60% of the sample being female. The initial diagnosis, the most common diagnosis was, of course, Alzheimer's. Some had the label dementia, others vascular dementia, mixed, very small numbers with Lewy body or frontal temporal dementia. There seemed to be more vascular dementia in Scotland, 25% as opposed to 10% of the overall sample. In Finland, they seemed very good at telling people it was Alzheimer's. 72% were told that in Finland, as opposed to 53% in the overall sample. The word dementia seemed to be used more in the Czech Republic. So some differences in how diagnoses were labelled. And this shows the year in which the diagnosis was first made. The average year is 2013, so on average the people had the diagnosis about 4 years ago. But you'll see there's quite a spread, there's quite a number in the last few years, and then smaller numbers going back over time. Okay. So that just describes the sample, so you get a feel for who these carers are. The first substantive question I want to talk about is this question: looking back, do you think the diagnosis was made at the right time? Was it a timely diagnosis? And what we found was that nearly half of the carers said it would have been better if the diagnosis had been made earlier. In terms of the diagnosis being made too soon, there were very tiny numbers said it was made too early. But you see more of a balance between those where it was made at the right time and those where it was too late. In the Netherlands, there's a slight majority in terms of saying it was done at the right time. The Netherlands has the lowest number of people reporting it was done too late. The other countries, it's perhaps more consistent. When we asked about what delayed a timely diagnosis, there were a number of factors that seemed to emerge from that. First of all, the person with dementia refusing to seek help. The carer and the person with dementia just putting it down to old age, just not being aware of dementia. So a number of things about attitudes and awareness, both of the person with dementia and the carer. The response of professionals was also important, and a third of our carers said that the first professional who was seen didn't consider anything was wrong. And another 6% said the first professional didn't think it was worth pursuing a diagnosis. So there were some attitudes of professionals that wasn't really helpful. And then there was just sort of slowness in the system. It took a long time to get a referral to the diagnostic services in 12%, and the diagnostic assessment itself took a long time in another 12%. But also we found in a quarter of cases that another condition was diagnosed before the dementia. And in a quarter of the cases, this was mild cognitive impairment. Another quarter of the cases, this was depression. I'm not sure how you make a diagnosis of old age, but it was done, it seems. And smaller numbers with anxiety and stress and a number of other conditions. And what's interesting is that when carers reported another condition was diagnosed first, they were more likely to say the diagnosis, when it came of dementia, was later than it should have been. Interestingly, there was more depression, anxiety and stress in Scotland and less MCI there. Now, one of the interesting things is that things should be getting better. With all these dementia plans across Europe, things should be changing. So one of the things we've been able to do is to compare those who had a diagnosis more recently with those who had a diagnosis a bit longer ago. And we've made a cut-off in terms of 2013, 2014 for the purposes of this presentation. And what I have to tell you is that there's no difference. That carers where the diagnosis was made more recently aren't saying it was more on time. In fact, they're saying it's got worse. Those who are more recently diagnosed say 49% of them say it was too late, compared with 45.5% before. That's not there's no change, basically, that's happening, is what I'm saying, which is disappointing. And if you look at this graph, the first bar for each country is, was it at the right time for those diagnosed further away, then right time for those diagnosed most recently, and then too late for those further away, and then too late for those most recently. And in fact, the only country that shows a pattern that looks like things are getting better is Scotland. All the other countries, things seem to be getting worse. Less people are saying it's on the right time, more people are saying it's too late. Now, before we get too excited about the wonderful success of the Scottish Dementia Strategy, I've looked in more detail at those figures, and they had a really good year in 2014. And then things have got worse again. Okay, thank you. Are the reasons for the delay changing? Well, essentially no. The attitudes of an awareness of the person with dementia are staying pretty much the same. Still, the person with dementia is refusing to seek help, and so on. The response of the professionals does seem to have improved a bit. So for people diagnosed further away, it was over a third thought the first professional didn't think anything was wrong, whereas now it's down to nearly a quarter. But still, systems are slow. So disappointing there. The second substantive thing I wanted to talk about was whether or not the person was informed about the diagnosis. And here we see that overall countries, 75% of people with dementia were informed of the diagnosis by a healthcare professional, something that we would, I think, across Europe expect to be happening. Except in Italy, and where there's a much smaller proportion of people who are actually told the diagnosis. And in most cases in Italy where the person wasn't told the diagnosis, it wasn't because the person with dementia said, no, I don't want to know. We wondered whether it was because perhaps dementia was diagnosed later, the dementia was more severe in Italy. And there's a slight suggestion that is the case. But over half of the people with dementia in the early stages in Italy weren't informed. And these were the sort of reasons that carers gave for why the person wasn't told. The doctor decided. He wouldn't understand it. It's pointless to torment him with it. She didn't understand. It would hurt her. For fear that he could get scared and react badly, and so on. There's a protection for the person with dementia that seems not to be thought necessary in other countries. The neurologist who has diagnosed the disease has not recommended it because the patient's very anxious and disturbed by the loss of memory. So I think this is a really important finding to feed back and to think about. Okay, I'm going to skip through a bit here. We looked at the actual process of the sharing the diagnosis where it was shared by a healthcare professional. And the point I wanted to draw out here was that in only a quarter of the cases was the person with dementia apparently asked if he or she wanted to know the diagnosis before the diagnosis was made. We would see pre-diagnostic counselling as really crucial. It doesn't seem to be people's experience. And the person with dementia not being asked about who else should be involved. On the other hand, people seem to feel quite happy about the way in which the doctor explained things. 80% said the doctor explained it very clearly. The specific diagnosis was stated rather than vague terms like forgetfulness or memory problems. In 2/3 of cases, the doctor established a good relationship. And in general, people felt that there wasn't a problem in the person understanding the diagnosis. People only thought the person didn't understand the diagnosis in about a quarter of cases. And then after the diagnosis, perhaps there was more of a problem there, where in only about half the cases was a clear summary of the meeting provided, and in 2/5 of cases, 40% of cases, there were no clear arrangements made for further contact and follow-up. And so that's maybe an area that could be improved across Europe. Referred to the need that people have for a named contact person or service who can assist in signposting. Only 33% of our carers reported receiving that service in the 6 months following diagnosis. And that ranged from 10% in Italy to 60% in the Netherlands, where they have a very good care manager system in place. But an additional 38% would have liked to have accessed such a service, but it wasn't offered. And of course, in Italy, that was the largest number there. So to round off, there are limitations to this survey. Yes, it's a large survey. We can make some comparison across countries, but there are differences. We've got a selected sample in a way. They're very educated. Daughters may be overrepresented. They're probably already in contact with Alzheimer's Society, which makes these findings all the more stark. You know, these are the carers who are more likely to be getting services and more likely to be able to work the system. The conclusions: timely diagnosis. We've seen some of the barriers. We need to look at awareness and raising education, because some of it is about the attitudes and feelings of the person with dementia and the carers. Some of it's about professionals. Some of it is about the difficulty some services have in making the diagnosis. There's no overall improvement in carers' perception of diagnosis as timely. Scope in some countries for diagnosis to be shared with more people, as is best practice. We need not to be overprotective. We need to look at pre-diagnostic counselling and celebrate there are some positive aspects. and, of course, do more to make sure there is this named contact person. Just want to thank Alzheimer Europe and all the participating organisations. Thank you.